Today we're going to look at the biggest mistake that watercolor artists make when mixing and matching color. So let's find out straight away. Let's not make you wait. What's the biggest mistake that artists make when mixing their watercolors and trying to match colors? It's not taking into account the actual properties of the thing that they're looking at and also the properties of the pigments themselves. There's a tendency to think of watercolors as pure color, but really they're not. We think of them as being almost ethereal, of not having dimension, but really those little pigments are three-dimensional. They're just very, very tiny. And all of the objects that you're looking at, they also have other properties than color. So what other properties am I talking about? We're going to look at three things today. So we're going to look at texture, we're going to look at opacity versus transparency, and we're going to look at color strength. Getting these matched as well as the color will give you the results that you're looking for. Now, before anybody comes into my comments saying, well, I don't need to match exact colors, Michelle, I can choose any colors I want. Absolutely, you can. This is about matching specific colors, but of course, you as an artist can choose to paint something a completely different color from what it is, and I would advise doing that sometimes just for fun. But even then, you probably have an idea in your head of what you want that color to look like. Today's video is going to help you to take your color matching so much further than just looking at the hue itself. So let's look first at texture versus a smoother surface. Some surfaces have texture and so do some watercolor pigments. Matching these up is going to give you better results. I've got a couple of samples of fabric here. So I've got some denim. This is the reverse of the denim. You can see that it has quite a texture to it. Not only does it have threads of different color, but it physically is slightly rough. And then I have this smoother piece of lining fabric here. It's got a slight sheen to it. So one thing to note is that an object that's shiny can never also be textured. Now, of course, you can have surface variation. You might find this sometimes on pottery. I've got a bowl here that's shiny and it also has some dimpling to it, but it's still very smooth overall and the surface texture is smooth. You see the shine on it. So if you're painting something smooth or shiny, you want to avoid using a granulating paint. Whereas if you've got something that's textured like this, or I've also got this lime here. It's got a slight sheen to it because even though it's got texture, the little lumps are quite smooth. It's got a sheen to it, but it will never have a bright shine because it's textured. Now, if I'm going to paint a lime like this, choosing colours that granulate, have little larger pigments in that dry speckly, that's going to be an advantage to painting something like this. Whereas if I choose granulating colours to paint something like this, I'm not going to get a very good shiny result. There's more to shine than just texture, but we'll talk about that later. So let's look at some colour choices if I were painting these. So I've just mixed some paints. I've got here some French ultramarine and I've mixed it with some Payne's grey, both of which colours tend to granulate. Now I might need to go a little bit darker with that and a little bit more into grey. Let's adjust it slightly. With a granulating pigment, you'll find you get a textured surface. Now let's look at a colour choice for this fabric over here. I've taken some phthalo blue, which is what they call a staining colour, so it's strong and transparent, and I've muted it down with a little bit of lemon yellow and some pink just to push it towards grey. Now I could have made the choice to mix Payne's grey in, but Payne's grey tends to granulate as well, and so I'd get a more textured effect, whereas I'm painting something smooth, so I want to choose smooth colours that don't have too many speckles in. You'll always get a little bit of texture on watercolour paper because it's slightly bumpy. Now there are other ways, luckily, of adding texture quite apart from the paint. We could choose a heavier, more rough paper, or we could scrape or sand the paper to give more texture. You see how the darker pigments are going to be attracted to the rough areas of paper here. Now, whilst we can add texture by using our paper, I wouldn't try going in the other direction. In other words, using very smooth paper to try and indicate smooth objects. And the reason for that is that the little bumps on the paper help to give a flat surface. They help the pigments to spread out. If you go too far into perhaps a shiny or a hot press paper, what will happen is your paint will sit in puddles and then you'll get drying lines. And so it doesn't really work to go completely in the opposite direction. But I hope I've shown you here how adjusting the pigments or the surface it's going on can help you to get a more realistic idea of a smooth surface or a rough surface. Next, let's look at strength of colour. So some things are just really, really strongly coloured or very, very pale, and some watercolour pigments have the exact same properties. So let's look at matching these effectively. So I mentioned that you'll never get a very shiny object by using granulating colours. You need to use smooth, transparent colours. Look at this shiny glass. But there's more to it than that. You also need strong colour contrast. You see how the light hits it. We've got pure areas of bright white. And you're best just to reserve your white paper for that. And then we've got strong darks next to it. So in order to get shiny things, we need strong darks. But there are other times we need strong darks as well. Things like tree trunks or very dark, stormy blue seas. There are even some strong dark purple flowers. We're always coming across things in life that are very dark. Now, certain pigments just don't go dark enough, so you need a selection of pigments. So let's look at some comparisons here. So here I've got some phthalo green. So phthalo is short for phthalocyanine. This colour is sometimes mislabeled viridian. It's not quite the same as a natural viridian. It's quite an unnatural colour. And if we look at the colour of it compared to my glass, it's not yellow enough. So if I was mixing this, I would want to add a transparent yellow into this colour. I've got a little here, and you see we start to adjust our colour. Let's look at another colour, another natural pigment. This one is called Terra Verte. I've probably pronounced that wrong. And although it's dried out in this little pot, you see it's just not dark at all. Now, it's certainly a beautiful colour. We might need a pale green like this sometimes. Be beautiful for a misty landscape or a very pale leaf. Let's look at some other colour comparisons. Another colour you may have in your set that's very weak and also very granular is cerulean blue. Let's compare it to the much stronger transparent phthalo blue, or a granulating colour but also one that goes fairly dark is this French ultramarine. Another example of a colour that you may have in your paint box that's really a very weak colour is raw umber. Now, people often avoid using the raw umber if they've got a set of paints and they just think, well, it's very wishy-washy. What's it even for? It's actually an incredibly useful colour. We can add things like Payne's grey to it, make mushroom colours, warm greys, beautiful colours for pathways and rocks, but it's never going to give us very strong dark tones. Let's contrast it with this burnt sienna that I have in my box, or some sepia. Again, I don't want to give you the impression that these bright, strong colours are the good ones and these pale, weak colours are the bad ones, because when we're doing some painting, we need both of these. We need all of these options. And you want to make sure that in your paint box, you have at least one or two strong staining colours to get the darks that you need, but don't discount these paler colours too. It's all about choosing the right ones for the subject, and you see how these darker ones really can do a great job of offsetting the lighter ones and giving us the strong contrast that we need for many things, including shiny objects. If you're finding this video helpful so far, and I really hope that you are, can I ask you please to like, share, subscribe, do all of the things, leave me a comment and tell me about your own colour mixing experiences. I really want to push this channel out to as many people as possible. If you free subscribe, it's a really big help to me. And this channel is, as I've mentioned before, fully cat approved. Next, let's look at something that's a little bit controversial, and that's opacity. You may have been told never to use opaque pigments and never to use white, but I'm going to put something out there, and I'm going to say that there are certain colours that you simply won't match exactly. You might get the colour, but you won't get the feel of them without a little bit of opacity. Opaque paints are nothing to be afraid of, as long as you know how to use them. So we talked a little bit about transparency. Let's talk about this in contrast to opacity. So I've got a very opaque item here. It's a lid of a little pot I keep some sewing objects in, and it's very light and it's very opaque. Now, standard watercolor advice says in order to get a pale color like this, you just add more water. And certainly adding water will bring your color lighter. I've got some permanent blue violet here. But I would suggest that it doesn't always give the exact same look as an item like this, particularly lighter items, particularly things that are traditional pastel colours. Where I live, we have a lot of sort of painted houses, chalky pale yellows or pale pinks. We have a famous colour around here called Suffolk Pink, and it's a very chalky, opaque colour. And to my mind, if you water down a colour like this, you just don't get the same look. So what can we do? We can consider choosing some of the pigments that are a little bit more opaque, or even using some white paint. So I've got a colour in my palette here that is cobalt violet, and it's a slightly opaque colour. Now we see it's a little bit too pink for this colour here. It could be adjusted, but I could also use white paint. So I think this one is closer in colour, but I want more opacity to it. I could try mixing them together, but I could also try, as I said, just mixing in some white paint. Now people are very frightened of white paint, and certainly you shouldn't use it all over your watercolour painting because it makes everything opaque. But I actually believe that for certain objects and in certain areas, it is the best way of getting the right colour. And not just getting the right colour, but getting the feeling of the colour as well. So look at this. We now have a colour that's much more opaque. I think it's maybe a little bit too dark, but we need to let it dry and see. But you can see how it works much better than just watering down the paint. Now, I do suggest using white sparingly. I wouldn't use it for any whites in a painting. For instance, if I was painting a snow scene, I would just use the white off the paper. But there are one or two occasions where I think using white paint is really, really effective. Now, when using white or any opaque pigments, you do want to avoid muddying up your whole painting. So I suggest if you're using white, you put it in a separate dish. I'll clean up that little bit of white that I got in my purple in a minute so it's not permanently polluting it. Paints that are semi-opaque or white don't layer well. They're very chalky, and so I suggest you put them on last. Don't try and work up lots of layers or you'll get a lot of mud appearing. If you've ever used gouache paints, you know what I'm talking about. Think about your white paint like you might think about cooking with chili. You might put your chili in your curry and that would be nice, but you wouldn't want it also in the rice, in the drink, in the bread. You wouldn't want it in everything, and it's the same with your white paint. Let's look at a couple more colours that you might own that are semi-opaque. I've got some yellow ochre here. Any cadmium colours you have will have a little bit more opacity than others. And there are a couple of yellows that are very opaque as well. One of my favourites is nickel titanate, and this one here is a Naples yellow. It's a version of Naples yellow. It's quite a light Naples yellow. But you'll find these colours are also opaque. Not only can they be very beautiful alone, but they can be used for something like splattering when you're doing things like beaches. Get little white pebbles or little yellow pebbles. Opaque and semi-opaque colours really are very interesting. And as long as you treat them carefully and don't allow them to mix into everything on your palette, apply them towards the end of your painting, you're going to get fantastic results. And don't forget, they should never be used for transparent objects like this, when we want to be choosing these strong, staining, transparent colours and using the white of the paper to glow through. I made a video all about when I think it's appropriate to use white paint. You'll find a link to that in the description of this video. But when you're choosing your colours, I want you not only to think about texture, to think about colour strength, but also to think about transparency. And in this way, you'll most accurately match the look of the thing that you're painting. So do let me know your thoughts in the comments. Did you find this tutorial useful? I've lots more colour mixing and other watercolour painting, mixed media and drawing tutorials coming up on this channel, so don't forget to subscribe. It's completely free. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. There's lots of free stuff down there for you. There's some free downloadable PDFs. There's also even some free courses that you can take. And if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to know about one colour that I think everybody should have in their palette, one colour that's going to be completely transformative to your colour mixing, you can watch this video next.